Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar hosted by the LinkedIn group HR Users of Psychometrics. My name is Nina and I'm the group manager. I'm delighted to introduce Tony Lyddon, who will be presenting this webinar today. So over to you, Tony.
Yes, thanks very much, Nina. This is the second of a number of webinars that I've been running. The first one was about basically why you should purchase psychometric testing for selection, a bit like purchasing a car or a home. If you want to hire an employee, then you need an expertise to make sure there's nothing hidden under the floorboards or under the bonnet that you don't know about. This is more about routine maintenance and also customization of employees once you've got them on board. I think what I'll do first of all is just bring up something that I thought you might be interested in, which is, just bear with me a minute while there we go. This is just trying to describe, I think, some of the things that can happen if careers are not managed properly. Certainly in my case, I didn't know to which point I was sailing for many, many years. And I also came across some winds which are not so favourable, which was basically bad advice. I won't go into that, but it's certainly important, I think, that people get good advice. Because if you've forgotten where you're going, then you can carry on doing the same things, which is the definition of insanity, and expecting a different result. Of course, if you get good advice but ignore it, then it is a bit like a sinking ship firing on the rescuers. But I think the last statement I thought was quite interesting. Yeah, you know, you basically reap what you sow, and you have to take some responsibility for your own actions. But as I hope I will show today, I think those of us involved in career management can help people to make informed choices about their career. Very brief refresher from the first session that I did, just to emphasize again that the importance of recruitment over training in the selection decision. And that really applies whether you're doing external recruitment or re-recruitment within the business, trying to work out if somebody's going to go to the next level and in what direction. Because the effectiveness of using these different techniques, including psychometrics and structured interviews and simulation, there is strong historical evidence of the increase in predictive correlation between the process and the outcome. And finally, the old Johari's window again, trying to reduce the amount of uncertainty when you're in selection by removing uncertainty in the mind of the person you're recruiting, but also in your own mind, and also reducing the size of that unknown area. I showed a similar slide in the first session that I ran. It's the means that are changing here, because what we're trying to look at this time is what you're doing in terms of managing the careers of individuals in your own business. And those of you familiar with talent management processes will know that it's not a question of just managing it in a 9-box grid, if you're familiar with that, but also what is the right career path, and also pooling of talent. It's very difficult to manage everybody's careers individually when organizations and indeed the economy is changing so rapidly. But what you can do is try and manage people's career aspirations through pooling similar people, and then looking to try and develop them into areas as they emerge. So it's about resourcing of internal talent, and that career selection methodology is important. But I think the other thing is making sure that your managers are familiar with what you're doing in terms of career management, so they don't get involved and make decisions which are basically throw you in completely the wrong direction. Because a lot of managers, like most engineers, think they know about how to change cycle tires and how to do HR management. I'm afraid there's a bit of that. But you also need to think about managing people's careers, so you look at them every couple of years to make sure they're still on track and the tools you're using to develop them are the right ones. Again, you're probably familiar, if you've joined me before, with the idea of the basket. That's skills and knowledge, experience and time on task still being in the equation, but paying a lot of attention to the behavioral aspects and also people's abilities, their abilities to function in a particular area, and trying to point them in the right direction based on their likely ability to be able to develop those behaviors and abilities, or even not to develop them any further. Those of you in big organizations will be familiar with the idea of a development center, and that's basically the same thing as an assessment center. It's a whole series of techniques for making sure that you gather evidence that can then be compared with other evidence to decide what the right answer is. And in fact, sometimes whether there's a different answer depending on the circumstances that people are in. Those of you who've done this sort of thing will know that sometimes people are much more effective in groups as opposed to one-in-one, and can be vice versa. So those are important things, and I won't go through the development center techniques with you here today, other than they're very similar to the things that you're probably familiar with: the ability to free your mind of what other things are on your mind, to observe and record what you're seeing from candidates before you categorize and evaluate. And the normal standards of training for competent assessors in behavioral observation is very important here, and of course the concept of peer review between them to maintain consistency of standards. Now, particularly in using psychometrics for career management, it may be that you haven't got the capability to run development centers. You're either too small an organization to do it, you haven't got the staff to do it, or the timing's all wrong. And all those things can happen. I have to say that I have used psychometrics in the area of career management over many years, and I think you can, on a one-to-one basis, start to map the things that are most likely to impact on people's career choices. And by using those tools to fit the results together and to start to think about hypotheses about how people might move forward. Well, I would say that after you've done that, it's really up to the individual to take that information away and them to make informed choices about what to do. But as we'll see a bit later, you shouldn't always expect people to do the things that you think they ought to do. As I said, it's up to them to do it. We've used the sort of trait profiling tools to get expert reports on things like leadership styles and how they prefer to work in teams, because those can be quite indicative of where people are leaders or followers, or people who prefer to operate in the middle or sometimes outside the team doing other things. And leadership styles can be important because some people can be highly directive, while others take a more consultative approach. And there are situations where one may be more appropriate than the other. I'm a great believer in situational leadership. I think if people can adapt their leadership styles to different situations, they have much more chance of success. But people are fixated on a particular style, it can land them in difficulty if that style is not acceptable. And I think you can see in the world now some of the conflicts in leadership styles between perhaps the people who like consensus decision making as opposed to those who are either highly directive or more negotiative. I think this is important to use these sort of tools because you may well find that some traits, personality traits, can change over time, but many may not change significantly, permanently, by over one standard deviation. And I think it's quite difficult to believe that somebody who reports that they are well below average on a particular trait will suddenly develop to become well above average. I just don't see that. I've never seen that in my career. I think one has to be careful to encourage development where development's just not possible. You have to accept that some things are less likely to change significantly. You can back up the trait profiling tools with type indicators such as Myers-Briggs, which help to understand the strengths of people's preferences in a particular direction. I mean, if people don't like to be in charge and they come across as being highly introverted in terms of how they prefer to behave, that is pretty clear that there must be some form of link. And then you have to decide, well, which one's actually leading? But as those of you who are familiar with typing indicators know, just bunging people in one of Myers-Briggs' 16 rooms doesn't help you understand the dynamics of how their preferences may work. And those are the areas which help them to think about how they ought to develop. There also may be areas where there are facets of how they might behave, say you're highly introverted, but actually they behave in an extroverted way. They act off preference because they're doing it for a purpose, and a purpose which is perhaps due to something else which could be described as their motivational values. If they're highly motivated, say, to help people develop their capabilities, then they may well extrovert to help them do it. And I have to say that's exactly how my profile works. Again, I'm not here to discuss my profile, but I think some people are surprised that I work in this area, because in some respects, if you looked at my type indicators, you might not think I would. But that's the important thing about using these tools, to try and identify those unknown unknowns, because they could be quite significant in terms of people's development. The motivational values thing, for people who are not familiar with it, it talks around the areas where people like to behave, driven by things that they developed at a very young age, and they might even be due to things they inherited, how they behave when they're under pressure, and then how they might behave in conflict. And it's some very useful conflict management tools that come out of that research. And there's a tool called Strength Deployment Inventory, which helps with that. So you'll see from this that in career management, and this is what the three main ones I've used in my career, OPQ being the trait profile normally, Myers-Briggs being the type 1, and SDI being motivational values, is to help me to approach the concept of career managing individuals from three slightly different directions. And I think it's important, again, I've showed this slide before if you've been with me before, but people need to make decisions about their stretch potential, and we'll come on to that a bit later. And for those who don't make those sorts of decisions, then the Monty Python joke on the right, you start realizing you haven't got some of your capability, and then you're just in denial about it. It really doesn't help at all. I want to talk a little bit about career streaming, because we talked about that a little earlier. I raised it earlier. Soft skills carry more weight than hard skills at executive level, and there's a lot of research around these areas. Competencies needed at professional management, in other words, high professional and executive high potential level, are now pretty well understood and are as different from each other as from those at operational level. And you could best describe those that you need at executive level are more about divergent thinking, the ability to make decisions with incomplete data, whereas a lot about professional management is about converging on solutions and delivering those solutions and managing those solutions. Similarly, doing more of the same at a higher level may not be the right thing to do unless it's what the job needs. And the third career stream, apart from high pro and hypo, is one that I've used in my career, is technical specialist. You might have somebody who's the chief scientist in a research group, and while he's managing people who have to do the same sort of things, those people are also converging in terms of how they approach their work, in terms of research and testing data and the hypotheses and so on and so forth. They're not having to manage the divergent thinking, but not necessarily divergent people. I've certainly worked in an environment where I had these sort of people, and they tend to get into conflict about ideas. They're not necessarily getting in conflict about themselves as individuals, but it's much more about the approach to solving different problems. And they are the last people you want trying to manage anything in terms of outside their technical area, because they just don't understand it. They're so focused. But similarly, you get people who perform at operational level, like your best car mechanic or your best sales executive, and you don't want to move them anywhere else, because that's where they add their most value. And indeed, the skills that you might need at executive level may be invisible to their customers and not what they want at all. If you want to look at the research, Lombardo and Eitinger's work in 1996, which the CIPD have ratified again in 2016, is a good source. I wanted to give you an example of a case that I did. And a lot of people, when they're presenting, they give good examples because they want you to feel good about them. I'm going to give you a bad example where I used the right approach, but it didn't go right in the end, because there's no justification for expecting that it's going to go right. Because if people don't make informed choices based on the best available to them, that's down to them. So let's look at this particular case. In my last organization, this person was a graduate mechanical engineer. He was sourcing and commissioning automated machinery into repair plants, actually, of pallets. He was in a small professional team doing the same thing, but it was quite the approach of that team was similar, but the characters in that team were quite different. In fact, I'm not sure the characters were all that well suited to it for various reasons, but nevertheless, the head was a professional manager, a high pro, had the engineering skills, had to spend a lot of time managing relationships with other functions such as operations to get things done. And he had a couple of other people there, one who was a commissioning engineer who had slightly more, I would call, social skills than this particular individual. And then another one who was quite an ideas type of person and actually came up with looking for new equipment. So you can see how that little team worked. This particular individual, very high advanced numerical and verbal critical reasoning skills, 80 percentile plus ones from memory. So he could really think he could work on his own. So he didn't need to look to other people to make his mind up, he thought, because he felt he could take the data available to him and reach a conclusion. And that is one of the dangers of having very high scores, that you think you can do it all yourselves. His profile I would summarize as somebody who was low persuasiveness, not very confident in their ability to change other people's opinions, like being in charge, high command skills, highly ambitious, but very low empathy and very low interest in how other people's behaved. As you might expect with somebody with these test scores, high data rationality, but actually had a low change orientation. So once it made their mind up, unlikely to actually change that mind, his mind. So what was his ambition? Production director. Now, actually, production director requires quite a lot of social skills because directors have to do political things. We'll look at that a bit later. My hypothesis was that this guy was more likely to be a chief engineer. So on the Starship Enterprise, he was going to be Scotty, not anybody else, not James T. Kirk. The consequence was a bit of a problem because I gave him his feedback, and I mapped out what I thought was likely to happen, and he didn't accept it. As you probably saw, there was potential for him not to accept it. So he looked outside because he thought his career with the organisation was finished, which was rather dumb, really, because it was a growing organisation and a global one, and he could have gone on to have quite a significant career. But he didn't accept it. He looked outside, and unfortunately, a small engineering company made him production director. So they thought they'd got somebody with potential. He got what he wanted. And unfortunately, he only lasted there 12 months because this particular small company probably didn't have the tools and techniques needed to make an informed decision themselves. And then the inevitable happened. And I had no influence on that because he went off. He was referenced and all that stuff. They just made the wrong decision as he did. I hope he's actually got his career on track. We lost contact with him. I really do hope so because he learned an important lesson there. I just hope he hasn't repeated it. Because unless he understands his basket, the things in his basket, then it's very difficult for him to go on and do the other things, which are about managing how your mind works so that you can start to manage your own development, think about your own potential, and if you like, take feedback and start thinking about feeding forward, because it's very easy to take feedback from people who say how wonderful you are and all that sort of stuff. But actually, it's not the past which necessarily is a good indicator of the future. So, returning to the basket, skills and knowledges can be refreshed. They are not going to be there all the time. And sometimes, of course, people haven't practiced them recently. Past experience I've just touched on. Time on task, people knew that, but just repeating what you've done on the past may not be right. And in fact, this individual, as you've already seen, probably overused their skills they were good at and avoided thinking about their derailers. So over and under use of skills and abilities well, let's refresh that, behaviors and abilities, is that one of the things that can be a serious derailer. So they're managing your chimp bit. I quickly refer to this because if you're really interested in this, I'd go and buy the book. Because the Chimp Paradox by Dr. Steve Peters is a simple way of taking the complex science of neuroscience and introducing it into your own thinking and the thinking of your business. Because what it does is it's talking about, it's trying to think about how you stop doing the things you shouldn't be doing and start doing the things that you should. It's a very oversimplified, some would say, the human mind, that separates it out into the rational mind, the emotional mind, and the computer, where the product of both is stored and is drawn down to deal with issues you come on at work. And I think any one of them can take complete control at any point, but there is actually an order in which information coming into your brain is processed, and primarily it starts off being processed emotionally. And that's what marketeers do every day of the week, and politicians do. They're trying to engage with your prejudices and your emotions, and your emotions are put those prejudices into your computer before your human side has a chance to deal with them. So how you deal with resetting the computer is start by managing this chimp, managing your emotions, trying to say, well, what's going on here when you get information? What is that information trying to do? And then analyzing it, and then deciding whether you're going to accept that information into your computer or not. And also going backwards and saying, well, if my reaction to that information was that, have I got something in my computer which really shouldn't be there? And that's where you get into the sort of areas of unconscious bias, or I prefer to call them semi-conscious bias, because they're in your computer. You know they're there, and you have to get them out. So getting that concept, this mind model, this chimp paradox thing in your brain, I think helps a lot of people to decide how to manage their development. I think if every 18-year-old had this book, it might change people's lives considerably. Because if you're going to start rewiring the brain, and neuroscience tells us that you can, I think you have to think about this idea of muscle memory. People like Gary Player or any golfer like Tiger Woods or McIlroy, they practice, but they've got talent, they've got the opportunity, they've got the drive, but unless they carry on practicing, they're unlikely to be highly successful. Because there's not a lot of difference between top performers. By the way, there's a lot of conflict at the moment about England football team not practicing to take penalties. So you'll probably hear a lot about that. But I think that's foolish. I think you should. They're talented people. They have the opportunity. They've got to try to succeed. You've got to develop muscle memory. And coping strategies can be learned. But the other thing that's going on, you need to understand what your stretch potential is and what your stress potential is. And anybody who knows anything about rubber bands knows you can stretch them, but at some point they will break. And that's because the capacity to grow has disappeared. But you all know there are different sorts of rubber bands around. And one of the other problems with development is sometimes you think about using something which you've got a lot of to do something that you shouldn't, and eventually your ability to do that runs out because again you find it just doesn't fit. So the way I like to think about this is you've got this sort of no sweat thing where the gap, your development gap is small and you can manage it using your rubber band. The gap's a bit wider, I'm comfortable, you can develop. It gets a bit wider, I'm still in control, perhaps I'm not totally comfortable. You get into your discomfort zone, which people like to put you in. Well, I feel I'm losing control there, but with a bit of coaching and mentoring, then probably you can manage that. And it's also quite good sometimes to be put a little bit out of your comfort zone, but then you get so stressed that your ability to manage your fear of failure gets so much that you fall over. And in many ways, developing people is getting that balance between I'm still in control and I'm stressed right. So I think that's the other important thing, is recognizing how far people can develop. And if they can't, then they should focus on things they can. So I've touched on this, but the feedback versus feed forward. But I think the feed forward thing, if you've got tools and techniques which are predictive and help people manage their risk, doesn't mean you remove risk, you just manage it. I think that is definitely the right way forward. Which brings us back to the original slide. Find that port, then you know what wind you've got to find to get you there. Don't carry on doing things that stop you getting where you want to go. Take good advice, but don't take bad advice. Then be responsible for your own actions. So you reap what you sow. And I think if you can help people understand that, as well as following that as your own example, then I think you will be well on the way to helping people get to their goals. And really, that is it. So I'm going to hand back to Nina for